Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and I want to welcome all of you here to a session on Cuba today and tomorrow. This program looks at recent changes in Cuba and their short and long-term implications, not only for the island itself, but for our relations with it. The event is sponsored by the New School's Global Studies program and the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. The Global Studies program prepares students for an interconnected world by emphasizing local and international internships and fieldwork, foreign languages, and cross-disciplinary study for our students. The ASCE is a nonprofit organization promoting scholarship on Cuba's economic and political transition with an emphasis on the country's financial, economic, social, legal, and environmental sectors. And we are pleased to have with us tonight's speaker, Jorge Domínguez. Jorge is an acclaimed Cuba and Latin American scholar at Harvard University. He is the Antonio Madero Professor for the Study of Mexico, also the Vice Provost for International Affairs, also Special Advisor for International Studies to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Chairman of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Hope they give you plenty of vacation. That's a lot of work.
I hope so.
Yeah. He has written and edited many books on Cuba, including several that are available for sale at the table. I think it's over to the left, or here we are, over here, over to your left. He is also the former president of the Latin American Studies Association, former board chairman of the Latin American Scholarship Program of American Universities, and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy. Tonight, Professor Domínguez analyzes recent developments in Cuba and their implications for the country's economy, governance structure, political system, and international relations. He will speak first, and then we'll have a question and answer session. We will be passing out in a little bit some cards on which you can put your questions. Oh, they're on the chairs already. Good, good. So, without further ado, we are delighted and honored to have you with us here tonight as our guest. Professor.
Delighted to be here. I will try to stand here and glance at my notes as I need them and to return to the New School for an opportunity to chat with you about a topic obviously of interest to so many of you. One way to think about contemporary Cuba and about the relation between its present and its likely future is to start with a topic that perhaps you might not expect. Pensions. One reason to think about pensions is that Fidel Castro is about to celebrate in August his 86th birthday, and Raúl Castro is about to celebrate his 81st, and that is an age when people think about pensions. But that's not what motivates me. What motivates me is to look at the set of decisions and the reasons for those decisions that Cuban leaders at first did not take when they should have taken them, and more recently, the ones that they have undertaken. Cuba has a population somewhat over 11 million people, and since approximately 1978, it has been below the demographic replacement level. That is to say, the number of Cubans being born is insufficient to reproduce this population. Over the past half dozen years or so, in all but 1 year, Cuba's population has actually net declined by small amounts, but it has declined. The fact that Cuba's demographic structure is now so different from what it was 50 years ago, when the revolution came to power in January of 1959, should have led Cuban decision makers 10, 15, 20 years ago, perhaps even closer to the early 1980s, to begin to think about how to care for a clearly and inexorably aging population. And Fidel Castro did not. One could say, well, maybe he didn't know. But we know that is not the case. Cuba has had for a long time excellent demographers who have been analyzing, documenting, and reporting this process that has been so clear and so uninterrupted. Indeed, there also was the option to read the proceedings of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, which has been publishing similar kinds of work now for a very long time. It was a conscious decision not to address an evident, significant, salient, highly consequential process of change. In December 2008, President Raúl Castro led the Cuban National Assembly to a unanimous vote to change pension policy just like that. Cuba had allowed women to retire with full pension at the age of 55, men to retire at full pension at the age of 60, and it got shifted with a very short adjustment period to 60 for women, 65 for men. It's interesting to note that the gender differential was not changed, even though in Cuba, as in other countries, women tend to live somewhat longer. But the adjustment of this pension policy was quick. What does that tell us? Tell us a number of things. It is first, and perhaps the one I want to emphasize the most, the change in the process of policy making from the decisions of one person to the use of evidence in the making of policy. And in a Cuba of the last half century, the idea that you would have evidence-based public policy is a very significant change. It's not perhaps exciting. It's not the sort of thing that would make your heart palpitate faster. But if you are thinking about public policy making in Cuba, this is a very big deal. It's equally important to understand that it's not just that fewer kids have been born for quite some time, but that life expectancy also lengthened so that those who are being born are living longer. The combination of these things tells you a great deal about the transformation of that society. Life expectancy is one way to say that nutrition is better. Cubans don't eat a lot. Cubans do not have an excess of calories for the most part, but there has been sufficient meeting of nutritional standards for a long period of time. Healthcare, and particularly preventive healthcare, the capacity to walk just a couple of blocks and see a doctor for a hypochondriac population that has spectacular frequent attendance at so-called family doctors. That also helps improve life expectancy. The combination of opportunities that developed, as well as the challenges and the hardships that occurred at the same time, made it necessary for women to get a job in the labor market and made it possible for women to get a job in the labor market. The majority of Cuban physicians have been women for a long time. The majority of students in different faculties at the University of Havana, with only 3 or 4 exceptions, have been women. And in Cuba, as in many other societies, when you educate girls, when you educate women, when they can become professionals, among the things that occurred is this demographic transformation. The size of families comes down. Pensions, boring as it sounds, begins to tell you a great deal about a society that has changed in many ways that are impressive, and I suspect all of you would say are laudable. And it also sheds some light about the transition in styles of decision-making, the manner of decision-making, and the capacity to do so. And a President, Raúl Castro, who lacks the charismatic features of his older brother, but who has been undertaking a process of policymaking that is changing Cuba in important ways. I'm going to talk in a minute a little more about economic circumstances, but I do want to make sure that we all understand that the changes that are underway are not just about the economy. And pensions, and the reason I begin with pensions, are surely not just about the economy. They are about the transformation of a society and the reasons why the population has aged, why ordinary Cubans have been relying on the state to make it possible for them to lead longer lives in dignity, and why they have made the choices and decisions that they have occurred that have deepened the circumstances, even if the cost to the Cuban state is a gigantic unfunded pension liability. Think of other changes. One of them is to respect people's time. The respect for people's time begins with the leadership. When Fidel was in charge, and good time to start a meeting was 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. Even better to have people waiting for a couple of hours out there until Fidel showed up so the meeting could start at 2 or 3 in the morning. There were frequent expectations that Fidel would call some march, preferably to the old U.S. Embassy building, downtown Havana, interrupting whatever it was that you were doing. Fidel believed, even late in his career, that he could, should, and did command the airwaves for radio and television, and that you were supposed to listen. By this time, his speeches had become short, only a couple of hours, but you were supposed to listen. Raul Castro respects your time. And in ways where that never mentioned the name of his brother, often begins speeches calling attention to his punctuality, that he wants to start on time, that he wants meetings to be brief, that he wants meetings to be for clear purposes. Marches are now only on designated public holidays. Meetings do not begin at 2 o'clock in the morning, and telenovelas start on time. They have not been set aside waiting for Fidel's speeches. The respect for time, Cubans are not necessarily punctual, but the greater respect for time is another important change in a society where you weren't sure how it was that your 24 hours were going to sort out for reasons unrelated to your personal choices. Second change of this sort that I think is worth highlighting, among the decisions Fidel Castro had made was that middle school kids had to go to boarding school away from their parents. And among the decisions that were reversed, allegedly in order to save on transportation and fuel, is that kids now could go to school in the cities, towns where they live, and of course be with their parents. I have nothing against boarding school. Many of my students have gone to boarding schools, but to make it compulsory for each and every individual to go to boarding school was a very big deal. And now to make it optional for parents, whether they do or don't want to send their kids to boarding school, is equally a big deal. It widens the array of choice if I can organize my time. It widens the array of choice if I can choose to have a family relationship that has my daughter or my son living with me at home. Take another very different example. Cuba in the middle of the 1960s was particularly harsh on homosexuals. The government created an entity called Military Units for Aid to Production. The acronym in Spanish is called UMAP, and thousands of people were sent to labor camps. They were sent for a variety of reasons, not just for being homosexuals, but that was the principal category. It was hard labor. It was so hard that, to the best of my knowledge, over the past 50 years, there's the only circumstance where a Cuban newspaper has published the record of a court-martial of a set of military officers for abusing prisoners is in the instance of the UMAP. The commander-in-chief of the UMAP was the Minister of the Armed Forces, and his name was Raul Castro. Raul Castro has a number of children. One of them, Mariela, heads a center for the National Center for the Study of Sexuality, which, in addition to providing a variety of services and studies and study materials with regard to sexuality, has the public commitment of trying to defend the rights of homosexuals. To make it clear in meetings, in discussions with government officials, and in the training, and this is her most important program in this regard, in the training of police officers. I've talked to police officers both from Cuba and who have traveled from outside of Cuba to participate in this training, that being a homosexual is not a crime under the laws of the Republic of Cuba. That being homosexual is not an aggravating circumstance. If I steal a chicken, if I am a homosexual, does not become an aggravating circumstance. that this daughter's father had the role that he did then, that this daughter's father has the role that he has today, speaks probably to a significant set of conversations at home where he was being a good dad and where, more recently, he has created a space for a kind of public activity in defense of the rights of human beings who had a very tough time. It was not just in the mid-1960s, but that was the most severe. That, too, is an important change. Whether you're thinking about the style of decision-making, the rights of homosexuals, the respect for time, decisions that allow parents and kids to have a different family life, any time you hear somebody tell you that there's no change in Cuba, say, ha. What's the urgency? Why is this leadership making some of these changes? Well, there are some real problems. Let me talk about two or three. Now that you have some idea of changes of different sorts, what are some of the motivating circumstances? So about 10 years ago, a really first-rate group of Cuban economists did a study of what they called politely population at risk. You and I might call it poverty. They defined population at risk as an individual who met all four of the following criteria. First was that cash income per month was below 100 pesos. The exchange rate is roughly 24 to 1 between the peso and the dollar, so below 100 pesos is very little money. Second, you did not grow your own food. So by definition, once you study it in this way and define it in this way, no one in the Cuban countryside could be defined as poor. That's a debatable question, but that's how they defined it. Moreover, if you lived in a house or in an apartment that had a backyard or a front yard or some green space in between where you might be able to grow vegetables, and you grow some vegetables and your neighbors grow others and you trade them, that also meant you were not poor. You could grow some of your food. Thirdly, you did not have the kind of job that gave you access to state cafeteria. Many people would eat a lot in the middle of the day so that whatever food they were allowed on the rationing card could be used by somebody else in their household. So you did not have access to a cafeteria. If you did, you didn't count as poor. Fourthly, and increasingly important over the last 20 years, you receive no remittances from abroad, from friends, from relatives, from anybody else. If you let those four categories roll on your mind, you're talking about significant hardship, and that was 1 out of every 5 Cubans. Let the same 4 criteria roll on your mind. You could say, well, if you meet 3 of them, it doesn't look so great. And in fact, about half of the population of Cuba could be defined by more general standards as being in a situation of severe hardship. Cuba, more generally, is not a country where you use the name of a country and the word opulence in the same sentence. But I am trying to indicate that for some category of Cubans, this really is very difficult. The Cuban median salary, different point, this is not now, but the Cuban median salary is approximately, translated into US dollars, 65 cents per day. If you've heard sort of World Bank standards for poverty worldwide as $1 a day, it means that the median Cuban is well below the World Bank's worldwide poverty standard. The reason I gave you the detail about how to define poverty is that it is important to take into account that there are some services for which Cubans do not pay. They do not pay for public schooling. They do not pay for the family doctor and so forth. But nevertheless, I do mention it's important to bear in mind that's what the median salary is, because it tells you that prosperity is not what characterizes the median Cuban. Another problem that the Cuban government faces is not just on the side of consumption, not just thinking about the poor. What are the capacities of individuals to try to increase the likelihood that they and their children and grandchildren would have a good life, but purely on the production side. As I look at this room, there's at least some of you old enough to remember that Cuba once was a significant producer of sugar. It stopped being a significant producer of sugar years ago. In fact, approximately a decade ago, if Cuba had had a market economy with the kind of laws and courts that go with a market economy, the entire sugar industry would have filed for bankruptcy under Chapter 11. To put it in numbers, at the end of the 1980s, a sugar harvest characteristically year after year produced over 8 million metric tons of sugar. Now, and in recent years, it is declared a terrific victory if a sugar harvest reaches 1.5 million metric tons of sugar. Approximately 3/4 of Cuba's sugar mills have been shuttered. You can now tour some of them as museums. And the remaining quarter, not all of them are working fully. A number are still under repair. Some of them engage in a relatively limited, relatively short sugar harvest compared to the longer sugar harvest of 20, 25 years ago. Cuba can no longer rely on the one product or the one subset of products around sugarcane on which it had built so much of its economic history. And if you don't have what you used to do before, you need to figure out something else to do. The Cuban government's response to this emergency included 2 responses that have some significance over time, and a third response that has turned out to be time limited. The 2 responses that were important, one is to open up the country for tourism. Cuba was a significant tourist destination up until 1960 approximately. The tourism industry was shut down primarily for political reasons. There was very little of it following 1960. And it has reopened so that now about 2.5 million international tourists have been visiting Cuba in the recent past. Second important change has been to welcome foreign direct investment, principally in the tourism sector. That is what has developed the tourism industry, but also in a number of other sectors, mainly on mining and in the development of energy resources. Cuba has had some significant successes in natural gas. It had flared natural gas up until the end of the 1980s. Now it has learned how to use it, and it is hoping and has had some limited success in increasing petroleum output. So tourism, foreign investment have worked. They're still limited. They could grow a great deal, but they have worked. The third hoped-for solution worked only temporarily, although it opens a window onto a possible tomorrow. And it was the relationship with President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I have no greater insight into President Hugo Chavez's health circumstances than you or I might look at in the newspaper, but he clearly is not well. And his likely lifespan is likely to be much shorter, certainly, than he would like. And the Cuban government is now keenly aware and has been keenly aware for a while, because Chavez goes to Cuba for his health care, that Chavez is in trouble. I don't want to detain into a discussion of Venezuela. I'd be happy to address that during time for questions and discussion. Let me simply say that I would never characterized this relationship as Venezuela subsidizing Cuba. Rather, it was a relationship of mutual benefit between the two that did allow, briefly, for a period of about 3 years in the middle of the last decade, the Cuban economy to perk up. The key element of that relationship that could in the future have additional good effects is that Cuba began to export for the first time not just commodities. Cuba had exported sugarcane. Cuba then in the 1990s came to export another commodity, beaches, sunlight. Notice that they require either not much creativity on the part of the Cubans, the sun, or they required mainly that you use your muscles, which is what you do with sugarcane if you don't have a lot of fuel for a great deal of equipment. For the first time, thanks to Hugo Chavez, Cuba began to export some of the results of the brain power of its people, not just brawn, but brains. And it is sending healthcare workers to Venezuela, physicians mainly, but also nurses, many other healthcare personnel, to send coaches, to send a variety of others to perform various kinds of professional services, and in that way to have the two central banks clear accounts of petroleum for professional services. It's not all that difficult to imagine that these same physicians in some future would be exporting healthcare services to the United States, where there would be a shuttle bus, but the shuttle being in the air, not on the ground, a shuttle bus between Miami and Havana, where Medicare would pay for a colonoscopy in Havana because it is a lot less expensive, and it is carried out by excellent physicians. Cuba's capacity to export healthcare services, Cuba's capacities to export other kinds of services is a discovery for the Cuban leadership owed to Hugo Chavez, and that and not other aspects of the relationship may continue. But the Hugo Chavez solution turned out to be temporary. This other idea of the export of health services is more my fantasy than a reality yet to take place. What then are other policy changes that have been undertaken to try to recognize the fact that tourism, foreign investment under Hugo Chavez were not going to get them to grow faster and to be able to afford the things that they would like to afford to make a better life for ordinary Cubans? Probably longer term, the most significant of these decisions is to allow what you and I would call small businesses. The Cuban government does not yet call it small businesses. The official the most common activity is to call it self-employment, empleo por cuenta propia. But it's not just self-employment in the sense that my toilet broke down at home and I need a plumber and I have to wait 3 months for the state plumbing enterprise to send me a plumber. And now under self-employment I can hire a self-employed plumber. Yes, I can do that. That is what self-employment means. That is what the change in regulations also means. But that plumber need not just be self-employed. That plumber can hire other plumbers to work in the same activity. So self-employment becomes a larger endeavor. It's not called small business. That's not yet politically correct. In addition to calling it self-employment, it's okay to call it non-state activities. Just as Cuba is not in a market transition, it is updating its socialism. So there are a number of verbal signs that indicate some ideological discomfort with the adoption of these policies, but the policies are real. At the end of 2011, Cuba tends to release information about trends and activities at the end of the calendar year when the National Assembly meets. And so at the end of 2011, there were about 360,000 individuals who had gotten a self-employment license. The science in my next sentence is extremely limited, but basically what Cuban economists do is they multiply times 4 per license in the number of people who are, in addition to the license holder, who are engaged in these small businesses. Out of a population of about 11.2 million people, a lot of them are still kids, you're talking about a significant amount of private economic activity that hitherto had not existed. As this private economic activity begins to grow and expand, it may have significant cumulative effects that would transform different elements of the society, the economy, and the politics. Thus far, though this, I think, is already and potentially even more a big change, there are a number of constraints that are also important to keep in mind. The most striking is the way the government has chosen to authorize self-employment activities, non-state activities, or small business activities. Government could have said, we are liberalizing petty services, except for the following 3 or 4 activities. Anything else can be done under self-employment. That's not what they decided to do. They decided to name the activity that was allowed. So tutoring kids to prepare for university exams is okay, but actually being a teacher in private service is not. Being a dandy, working in, dressed as a dandy in the old city for tourists is okay, but other sorts of activities in the old city are not allowed. Musical bands that now can be in the private sector, that can be self-employment activities, and named by the type of music. So if you play that type of music, it is okay. If you play another type of music, it has to be a state band. There's about 200 of these named categories. It's a smaller number. They have been adding to it. Let me just give you an example of one that I find particularly telling. So last fall, the government added a new activity that now could be self-employment, which it is fiestas para quinceañeras. 15-year birthday parties for girls. Now, think about some of the elements of that decision. It means that activity had been prohibited. Why in the world would the government care? How is it that you or I organized with our 15-year-old daughter what her birthday would be like? But it was formally illegal to do that. Secondly, by choosing to authorize the change in this way, the government, instead of saying, any of these activities can be done any way that you want to, the government is also signaling that it can take it away. So that it is a way in which, intentionally or unintentionally, the government is refraining the capacity of this new private sector to grow and to generate new jobs and to generate new economic activities. Because there's an uncertainty that once you choose to make policy in this way, not only may you authorize, but you also may pull it away. Next point about the exact same behavior. It had been happening all along. It happened to be illegal, but it meant that citizens who might otherwise prefer to be law-abiding were breaking the law because they were hiring people to run these parties anyway. And therefore, among the main advocates of this legalization was, I'll give you a minute to think about it, maybe not a minute, but at least 10 seconds, state security. If you are in the business of protecting the security of the Cuban state, you have better things to do than chasing after parents who are organizing illegally birthdays for their 15-year-old daughter, hiring somebody in the private sector. Take another element of the exact same decision. I don't know about you. I realize I only have met some of you, but my wife and I have 2 daughters, and they did go through their 15th birthday party. We didn't hire anybody. We were a couple, and my wife was in charge of all the creative, fun activities. I was the one who took care of the trash. And, so we had very clear division of labor in the family, but we didn't hire anybody. Why not? Well, it was kind of expensive. Aha! It means that you're now making legal an activity that in this form can only be accessed by those who have more significant wealth. So the very fact of authorizing an activity of this kind is catering to a widened income inequality. Cuba had been a remarkably egalitarian society, not just equality of opportunity, but equality of result. The gap between those who had and those who did not have was very narrow. And now there is a variety of specific activities that only those who have significant money can be able to access. And so you can look at some of these activities, and each of them gives you, it's like peeling an onion, gives you a different take on a set of circumstances in the society. Take a different perspective on the same question of self-employment. Talking too long. But I do want to mention the tax law. So the tax law of December of 2010, remember, National Assembly, end of the year. The tax law is framed, this is the new tax law, as Cuba is opening up its economy, to say that it will prevent excessive concentration of income. And one of its instruments to prevent excessive concentration of income is that as you hire more workers, the first 5 are okay. As you hire worker number 6, we're not talking, in my view of the world, about a very big company. We're talking about worker number 6, worker number 7. Per worker, your tax rate goes up. No. It's not just that you're making more money. No, your tax rate goes up. That tax law is an impressive disincentive to the creation of jobs in the formal sector, to the creation of lawful jobs. I may be the self-employed license holder, the CEO of this micro company, and hire people illegally. And if so, the tax law would be fostering that. But I do find it mind-boggling that a government that wants to grow the economy and that needs to create jobs chose to adopt that type of tax law. Shift sectors, agriculture. Sugar industry went bankrupt. Well, you could imagine trying to adjust and begin to grow other things. You're not going to grow sugar cane, you might grow something else. By 2008, there were 2.25 million hectares of idle land. This essentially were the abandoned former sugarcane fields. Nothing. What was growing, there's a Raúl Castro speech going around saying, and I was, going in a car, and I looked out, and I saw these particularly nasty weeds that grow in a number of Caribbean countries, in Cuba called marabu. Marabu is not a problem if you have very heavy equipment. Marabu is a problem in a country that doesn't have this type of agricultural equipment. The only way to pull it out is, hold on. So, change agriculture. Now in state farms, individuals can go and begin to grow whatever it is that they want to in any way that they want to, but they don't have title to the land. All they have is the right to use this land. Moreover, they don't have the right to use this land for a period where if they do it well, it could be extended, but it's only for 10 years. And if you build stuff on top of the land, whatever you build on top of the land, in principle, title belongs to the state. Your incentive to work very hard at this is not as much as if you said, okay, this actually is, even if it belongs to the state, whatever I would add, it would be to my advantage and to the advantage of those whom I hire to work with me or to my family. But interestingly, at the end of last year, there were still 1.25 million hectares of idle land because middle-level government officials and municipal officials have been undermining the policy that would allow, modest as the policy is, to undertake this type of significant change in agriculture. Raúl Castro is not his brother in politics. I mentioned before he was not a charismatic individual. I've talked a little bit about his change in ways of making policy, evidence-based policy making. But in this regard, he probably is missing one of the important capacities of his brother. When his brother gave an order, the answer was, sí, comandante. It's not happening now. So, after 3 years, 2008, end of 2011, you still have more than half of these idle lands remaining idle. Take a different policy announced in the fall of 10, which was to dismiss 500,000 workers from state agencies. Remember, country population, 11 million people, dismissing 500,000. There's a lot of people dismissing them. The policy announcement said in 6 months. 6 months later, the policy was canceled. The number dismissed was somewhat over 100,000, but not more. And Raul Castro, to his credit, took responsibility for the failure of his government to be able to implement the policy that he had chosen to indicate. These political changes are, to me, among the most interesting features in this change in Cuba. It's not just that new policies, new things are being authorized that may empower many others to take clear charge of their lives, but that the government is less capable of governing following the decisions of the leader. And in Cuba, as it has actually existed, the notion that someone named Castro as president of Cuba cannot govern because middle-level functionaries do not obey, this is big political news. There are other political changes that matter, and I now do want to stop in a couple of minutes. One, rarely mentioned, so that's why I want to give it at least 1 minute, is Raul Castro formally becomes president of Cuba in February of 2008. He became acting president July 31, 2006, when his brother went to the hospital. But the previous month, January of 2008, Cuba had an election to which no one paid any attention. True, Cuban elections are a little boring. There's only one party that can do campaigning, and the number of candidates is equal to the number of seats in the National Assembly. So, you know, you don't work all that hard in the campaign. It really, you know, it's not. Even so, a Cuban voter has a limited array of choice to indicate unhappiness with a given candidate. So it's not only the number of seats, but for reasons that are no need to explain, Cuba chooses to have voting clustered. So I may go into a voting booth, and in that district, there are 2 slots to be filled, and there are 2 candidates for the 2 slots. Or I may be going in another district, there might be 4 slots and 4 candidates. But when there are that many, the official slogan of the party is vote for the united slate. But it means that you, as the individual voter, have a choice. You could vote for one candidate, but not for the other. Or you could annul your ballot, or you could leave it blank. So I'm not counting those who abstain, who don't come to the polls. Any number of reasons people may not come to the polls. They may have a bad cold that morning, or grandma may have fallen sick and I'm taking care of her. These are people who show up at the polls, and they engage in one of 3 non-conforming acts. They void the ballot, they vote blank, or they vote selectively, meaning for some but not for others. In January of 2008, the month before Raul Castro became president, 1.1 million Cubans cast a non-conforming ballot. It's a lot of people. Makes that election a lot more interesting. There's a lot of interesting applied statistical analysis to be done as to why some candidates get fewer votes than others. This is a population that is ready for some kind of political choice beyond these 3 non-conforming behaviors. Bear that in mind. Raul Castro has now freed, by the Amnesty International count, I believe, all listed political prisoners. There is a very reasonable and important debate that a number of people who are in Cuban prisons for charges not against state security, but for stealing a chicken, may in fact have been locked up for political reasons. Even that number is a small 3-digit number, and that is an important and welcome change. Still problematic in an authoritarian regime, but it is moving in the right direction. Raul Castro chose, in this decision to free political prisoners, to act in a way that he was not required. He chose to call on the Cardinal Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Havana, Jaime Ortega, to be his interlocutor and to send church officials to interview and speak with the political prisoners and their relatives and to try to ascertain where their decisions are. And to convey this, he had himself filmed and photographed, broadcast on Cuban national television and in the front page of the newspaper. The Cardinal is my interlocutor. And in so doing, he opened a process of political change that had remained closed before. Cuba, let's be clear, is not a Roman Catholic country. This is not Poland. On a good, bright Sunday, 5% of Cubans show up at Roman Catholic Mass on Sunday. But nevertheless, authorizing someone who is not a member of the Communist Party, who had been in the opposition, who had been sent to the UMAP work camps in the middle of the 1960s. That's where the young Jaime Ortega went. This is a very big change. For the future, among the Cuban transitions, not just the aging of the population, there are a number of things to bear in mind. This is a population that got accustomed to equality of outcomes and that believes in equality of outcomes. And in whatever kind of conversation, whether it's the ethnographic work of some or the public opinion polling and others, a large proportion of Cubans criticize the relatively modest, albeit important, economic policy changes Raul Castro has undertaken because they are generating inequality. No matter the name of Cuba's president now or in the future, this ideological set of circumstances matters. Cubans not only believe in equality, but got accustomed to something that I'll call the welfare state. They really do expect that schools would be good and that it would be for free. They really do expect that health care would be good and that it would be for free, and that they would get a complicated surgery for free, that they would get access to the family doctor down the street for free, that there would be lots of family doctors to whom they may go. This is very expensive. Cuba can't pay for it now. Hasn't paid for it ever in the last 50 years. This is what the Soviet Union paid for. This is what Hugo Chavez paid for. Now they have to pay it in some way. And this is a legacy also for the future. Another political legacy is one that is probably, to me, the most surprising decision of Raul Castro. And it is not to prepare for a generational change. So there was a party congress, Communist Party Congress, about a year ago, spring of 2011. The previous one had been in 1997. In 1997, the median age of the 24-member political bureau, the key decision-making organ in Cuba by any levels, the median age was 54 years. Okay. Median age of last spring's political bureau was 70. He got rid of the young ones. He kept the old ones. And as if to signal it, his number two, his first vice president, the second secretary of the Communist Party, is 1 year older than he is. This is not the way to prepare for the future if you care about the future that would continue some of your policies and your values. And the inability of the two Castro brothers and the close team of collaborators to plan for a transition. Whether the transition would work to their advantage or not is a different question. But not to plan for it means that the likelihood of political rupture is greater than if they had planned for it. The last point to be made in this issue of political change is my favorite Raul Castro quotation, and I look at my notes to make sure that I get it right. So at the December 2010 National Assembly, as it was about to adjourn, he addressed the Assembly, sort of a rhetorical question, minutes before adjournment. I'll read it in Spanish and then translate it. ¿Por qué tenemos que meternos en la vida de la gente? Why do we have to butt in on people's lives? Well, it's an interesting question. The government of which he had been the number two for a half century had done that as a matter of high policy each and every day. And now he was questioning. I don't think Raul Castro is a closet liberal. But I do think that he is thinking in ways that have liberal implications. And the more he does, the more Cuba's changes would be not just of the sort that I have described, which I would, again, classify them as modest but important, but a wider array of changes that, at least potentially, permits thinking about a different Cuba from the one we've known certainly most of my lifetime. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jorge. That was excellent. I think I learned more about Cuba in that short period of time than in my whole 60 years on this earth. So that was quite fascinating. If you would pass your questions over, they have an either end. Okay, and one other thing I'd ask is if we have students here, please indicate that on your question. I'm using the honor system too, so I'm using the honor system. So please indicate that in your question. While we're waiting for that, I had a couple questions myself. First of all, just a very banal one, but what kind of music could you perform privately? What kind of music couldn't you?
So for the most part, the bands that have been authorized are playing the music of my parents. And it is in the expectation that they would be playing in tourism facilities, where people who may have listened to the Buena Vista Social Club and who think of that as being the music of Cuba will be able to hear that music, which is the music of my parents.
Okay, all right, all right. So other things like rock, jazz, other things are...
So rock music, Cuba is the only country I know that has two parks. One is called Lenin, this we would expect, and the other one is called Lennon, and this might be a little more surprising. And what is interesting about this park, this was done under Fidel Castro, this is before Raúl Castro became president, is that in the mid-late 1960s, Cuba censored the Beatles. You couldn't play Beatles music on the radio, or in the radio, or anywhere in a public facility. And decades later, this was seen as stupid. And in a sense, as a public apology. I mean, it is interesting when the same ruler in power, not by using the words apology, but by dedicating a park after John Lennon, does this. And there is a spectacular John Lennon statue. This John Lennon has eyeglasses. The eyeglasses are a prize for thieves. And so there is a volunteer group that takes turns watching the John Lennon statue to protect the glasses. But anyway, so this speaks to the music. So Cuba has had active censorship of kinds of music, and it's become more relaxed.
Oh, interesting. One other question I'd ask, and then I'll turn to these, is your portrait of Raúl Castro is very intriguing. And it reminds me to some extent of some characterizations of Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union. And the characterization would be, if I understand what you're saying, that this is a person with some inclinations towards liberality, at the same time holding on to the old system, and almost with a idea that somehow it'll all work out, and that the legacy of the Castro brothers be maintained, and at the same time, is that?
No, I think it's a very good analogy, and I think that, as in the case of Gorbachev, these are two human beings who I think at some moment in their careers changed some significant views. That's why I mentioned that it is the same human being, Raúl Castro, who had been in charge of these labor camps where homosexuals and others were sent in the 1960s, whose daughter, under whose protection he's working under his protection, now in effect is trying to remedy some of the legacies of what her dad had done in the 1960s. So I think that on a number of topics, he has changed his views. Let me give you a different topic on which I believe he's changed his views. He had been very much a part of the collectivization of agriculture, state farm creation. And at least by the early 1990s, he had come to the view that that had not worked. And the only topic on which there's public evidence of a disagreement between the two Castro brothers is in the early 1990s on agriculture, where Fidel wanted to hold on to the old system of state farms, and Raúl picks a journalist and obviously negotiates the questions in advance. And the journalist asks him, General, because the formal title is the General of the Army, General, what is the greatest national security threat to our country? And Raúl Castro's answer was to feed our people. and the agricultural policy changed 2 months later.
Wow, wow, yeah, interesting. All right, let me turn to some of your questions. First is a topic you didn't touch on, and but I'm sure everybody's asking, what do you think the embargo affects, how it affects the Cuban economy right now?
So U.S. embargo effects were certainly very significant in the 1960s. They continue to remain significant, though now in more subtle ways. An example of more subtle ways is the U.S. continues to chase after financial institutions in, say, Western Europe or Canada that seek to finance activities in Cuba, and imposes penalties that are charged on the operations of those financial institutions in the United States. The effect of that is that Cuba needs to pay more than it otherwise would for insurance of a shipment. That Cuba needs to pay more than it would for trade credits, international trade credits. So there are a number of the ways in which the embargo continues to have an effect is at the margin, but the word margin, taking it seriously as economists do, their costs are significantly higher. There are some that are more direct. So it is possible that some of the people in this room might want to travel to Cuba and lie on the beach. Under the laws of the United States, that is illegal. That is another way in which the embargo continues to matter. If the new school, or in my case, Harvard University, wants to send students to study abroad in Cuba, it can be done, but there is a very complicated rigmarole of regulations, which imposes high legal costs on any college or university, therefore deterring university presidents or university vice provosts from undertaking these activities. So there are these types of continuing effects.
What I should follow up on that question in terms of what do you see? I mean, there's a big debate going on in the U.S. right now about the policy towards Cuba, and it's moved from probably a fairly monolithic view, at least politically, to a more nuanced view. What would accelerate change in Cuba? Is it to stick to our policies? Would it be to let up on the embargo policies of various types?
My view is that the policy of the U.S. in this regard toward Cuba certainly makes much less sense now than it ever did. But even at times past, much of it made no sense. Take an example. Making it so difficult for some of the people in this room to travel to Cuba on their own just by, buying an airfare. Why should it be the preference of the U.S. government to assist Cuban state security to censor information from the outside to which Cubans might be available? Because that, in fact, is what the prohibition on travel does. I've never understood it. Why is it that the United States wants to continue to make it difficult for Cuba to have the sort of computer equipment that would make access to the internet easier, that would make access to email easier? Why should the U.S. government think that it should assist Cuban state security in blocking access to information from the outside? None of that communication side of it has made ever much sense to me.
Just a quick response to those two. The second one might be there was a security fear of using the equipment, the computer equipment in military uses. And the first would be providing hard currency to the Cuban government.
It provides hard currency to the Cuban government. What we do know about the hard currency circulation in Cuba is that its main effect has been, take a much more direct example, remittances from Cuban Americans. Mm-hmm. Which have been authorized now for some time and liberalized under the Obama administration. Hard to calculate, so the number I'm going to give you has big error estimates on both sides, but $1 billion per year. So this adds money. The main effect of it is to make it possible for individuals not to depend on the Cuban state. That is what is financing these small businesses. That is what is, in lieu of a financial system in Cuba, Cuba really has a primitive financial system. This is what is making it possible. So yes, there is more money, and yes, the Cuban government will tax the products of remittances. But if you're looking to accelerate social and economic change, freeing individuals from having to depend on the state is one way to go.
Yeah. Let me shift a little bit with another good question we have here. Given that Fidel and Raul are both in their 80s, who's likely to take over leadership of Cuba, and what other changes will this bring to the country?
Right, so remember that both of them are now in their 80s. The median age of the Political Bureau was 70 last year. I regret to tell you, it means that it's 71 now. It's pretty inexorable. This is not a young leadership by any standards. Now what has begun to occur is, hardly a month goes by when someone who has been leading a significant agency or wing of the Communist Party does not have to step down or become gravely ill for one reason or another. This leadership is not prepared for a succession. There is a relatively small number of younger officials. Probably the most, currently the most successful is someone who just stepped down as Minister of Higher Education, who had been Party Secretary General in the province, so he has both experience in the provinces, he has experience at the national level, he has now been a member of the Political Bureau for a number of years, Miguel Díaz-Canel. But one of the elements of the track record of the leadership is that when someone seems to assume a position of significance, that person is dismissed. So the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has also been aging. Cuba has the oldest active duty general staff of any country I know, because there's not been a transition there either. There's been a little bit more of a transition, but not much.
Right, wow. I've got a couple long questions here. I'm sorry. Let me get through. There's oil in the Gulf of Mexico off the Cuban shores. What will that mean for Cuba in the future?
So let me connect this in part to the U.S. question, because the Gulf of Mexico, Cuba is not the only country that has water in the Gulf of Mexico. So in 1977, the U.S. and Cuban governments signed an agreement to delimit maritime jurisdiction. This is in the context of negotiations of the law of the seas, and it's important to know what is your territorial sea, what is your maritime jurisdiction, and therefore where the boundary is where Cuba and the United States touch on each other. That agreement was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. So technically, Cuba and the United States have an undefined border. Not particularly helpful at the moment when everybody's drilling around. Both the U.S. and Cuba have behaved as if that is the boundary, so we know where it is. Nevertheless, the drilling anywhere on the northern shore of Cuba, whether in the Gulf of Mexico or along the Straits of Florida, does illustrate the value of an ongoing relationship between the United States and Cuba and Mexico and the Bahamas about what do you do with an oil spill. What do you do if there is an accident, whether it's on a ship or whether it's in a drilling effort? And these conversations are, barely at the we might have them stage. It's difficult to know how much there is there. It is pretty clear that there is a fair amount of natural gas, and that Cuba now has learned how to use natural gas. This takes me well beyond my comfort zone in terms of expertise. Petroleum geology is not something I claim much knowledge about, but there is a difference between potential reserves, confirmed reserves, The reserves that, on which there's some international understanding, so it's not just Cuban government, but it's international petroleum companies, the U.S. Geological Survey's own older records, cooperative discussions with Russian geologists from the time when there was the Soviet Union, indicate that, yes, there is a significant potential, that Cuba could become self-sufficient in energy resources. The most hopeful, from Cuba's perspective, the most hopeful scenario would have Cuba becoming energy self-sufficient in a half dozen years. Mm-hmm. But that would assume that everything would go right. Yeah. But it's honestly difficult to know.
Are they putting, is there much foreign direct investment now, or is the Cuban government putting much oil?
There's
much
mainly
money
foreign
this?
investment. Cuba doesn't really have the capacity to do this on its own. Cuban state enterprise mainly plays the role of regulator and partner with these foreigners, but doesn't bring the technology or the capital.
Right. Another question, great questions. You've got lots of good questions. I'm sorry I won't get to all of them, but here's one. What are the Cuba-Russia and Cuba-China relationships like these days, and how have they changed since Raul Castro took power?
So Raul Castro had built very close relations with the Soviet government when there was a Soviet Union. He really managed a good deal of it. It's important to remember that until the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union had transferred a great deal of military equipment and weapons to Cuba free of charge. It was the only country in the world to which the Soviet Union shipped vast quantities of military material free of charge. Good to remember that until the early 1990s, the Soviet Union still had troops in Cuba. All of that came to an end. Cuban-Russian relations were not particularly good in the 1990s. They were not terrible, but they were not particularly good. They actually worsened a bit when Vladimir Putin became head of the Russian government. But they've begun to improve during the course of the last decade on a number of levels. But there's a very modest military relationship, really tiny. There is some of a commercial relationship, but not very much. Russia is really not particularly important to Cuba. China is. China and Cuba had terrible political relations from the time in January 1966 when Fidel Castro publicly accused Mao of being senile. Mao may or may not have been senile, but at any rate, they did not make for warm relations. At the symbolic level, though Cuban-Chinese trade continued to be important, rice for sugar, Cuba stopped recording in its international trade statistics that it traded with China, and there was this big category called otros, other, where Chinese trade was hidden. But by the beginning of the 1990s, China and Cuba discovered there are not many communist countries left around. They might as well try to hang together. Cuba even changes its voting behavior in the UN General Assembly, and for the first time since 1959, 1960, aligns with the People's Republic of China. So there are a number of these things. China is now second only to Venezuela in Cuba's commercial relationship. China has more spoken about investment than done some investment, but it has done some investment. China has shipped to Cuba one of the, in terms of political and social impact, one of the most effective relations has been shipping buses. And so bus transportation in the city of Havana, which had become really terrible in the 1990s, improved. Chinese officials insisted that Cuban officials could use Chinese buses only on streets that had been repaved so that the potholes would not destroy the buses, so that's a constraint. But nevertheless, Chinese buses have worked much more effectively. China has provided some financing to the Cuban government, but unlike Venezuela, China has insisted that Cuban pay for the things that it buys from China. The Cuban-Chinese trade deficit is small and has narrowed. And Chinese government officials keep badgering the Cuban government to enact market reforms. And so one of the interesting ways is that, yes, this is a relation between two communist governments, but China is a force for change in Cuba.
Another question, how are the political economic changes reflected in the Cuban press? Is there a greater degree of press freedom in the country now?
It's a very good question. I have difficulty using the expression press freedom. That's not
it's a relative term.
Quite, but a relative term. So let me give you two examples of moving in that direction. One is clearly an example of greater press freedom, and the other one is an important change, but not quite press freedom. So the latter one is, so Cuba's newspapers have begun to publish letters to the editor. This had been done for a time in the 1970s and early 80s, then it was suppressed for a very long time, begun to reappear. Letters to the editor is not an example of press freedom because the editor, of course, chooses what to do. But many, just as you are performing this function here, what is interesting about the letters to the editor that are printed is a number of these letters are very critical. The ones that are most critical are critical of the bakery at the corner or the repair services of the electric power company. So they're very concrete, they're very targeted, and those letters are often devastating. And they are followed a few days later, maybe a month later, by an apology from the bakery at the corner or the repair services and promises that we have addressed them. Then there are the more sort of broad gauge letters, and they tend not to be as sharp. So I think that's an important change. These letters appear only on Friday. You can read the Cuban press, translated into English on the web. And so if you want to see this type of debate, go read it on Friday. An example of press freedom in a more normal way that I think we would all understand it is to allow the magazines of the Roman Catholic Church, another dimension of the state-church relationship, to publish more freely. And so each of the dioceses, there's I think 13, although I may get the number wrong, has a magazine. There are two big ones in the Archdiocese of Havana, and one magazine, both magazines can be read on the web, Palabra Nueva and Espacio Laical. The second one, Espacio Laical, more than half of the text of any given issue is not about religious topics, narrowly construed. It's really commentary on social, economic, and at times political issues that come pretty close to your definition or mine or anybody's here of press freedom. Sometimes they publish debates where they have people from Cuba and from outside Cuba. I've participated in some of these debates. I've published in these magazines. And so that is a non-trivial widening of public space for discussion.
You mentioned the idea of the export of Cuban healthcare. How might this be a possibility while addressing the issue of the aging population?
So Cuba has deliberately continued to take in a very large number of students into the Faculty of Medicine. This is one way in which you can continue to staff your own healthcare system. It is what has made it possible to deploy healthcare personnel for political motives, which Cuba had done for a very long time, to different parts of the world. Dozens of countries, for political reasons, had received Cuban healthcare personnel. In some small African countries, more than half of all healthcare providers were Cubans. In many ways, really amazing. So the innovation with regard to Venezuela in the early in the last decade, about 9 years ago, was to do it to generate revenue. Yeah. And that this was a way to pay for Venezuelan petroleum. The reason to call it trade rather than just Venezuelan help is that, yes, Venezuela sold to Cuba petroleum discounted on the world market, but Cuba was supplying healthcare services discounted on the world market. That's why you needed the two central banks to monetize these two transactions to make sure that they would clear. Because Cuba has continued to produce so many physicians and nurses and others, it has been possible to do this with thus far some constraint on the access to healthcare services in Cuba, longer queues, longer waiting time, but frankly still relatively quick access. So for major surgery, I have a daughter who lives in Toronto. For a major surgery or operation, the waiting time in Havana remains shorter than for my daughter in Toronto.
Following up on that issue, as an educator, I'm always wondering, how the healthcare system is known for being quite good in Cuba. It's one of its better attributes. How have they been able to support and finance the education? Healthcare education is extremely expensive to do.
So this is one of the uses of the resources that they have received from outside. One of the ways to pay for the healthcare system is physicians do not earn, they earn above median, but not much above median. So the Cuban healthcare system has been demonetized to a very significant extent, and that's how it is paid for. But the financing of higher education has taken place primarily from outside resources. It does mean, however, that the lack of international financing for political reasons does not enable Cuba to replace aging equipment that is also necessary to train first-rate healthcare personnel. So for more complicated and certainly more up-to-date medical procedures, Cuba now cannot perform, does not perform as well as it used to. So a lot of the services that they can provide tend to be for standardized and lower tech medical procedures, not the fancier thing that one might find in Canada, the United States, Western Europe, or Japan.
Has the number of Americans traveling to Cuba increased dramatically since Obama?
It has increased because it allowed travel for a variety of non-beach purposes. And that's the key. It's not for the beach. So you can go with an alumni association to look at museums, to look at monuments, to hear lectures in one set or another, to look at art galleries. I mean, there are a number of really very interesting activities. And also, U.S. citizens who are Cuban Americans can go to visit their relatives. So if you count those who are of Cuban origin and those who are going for these broader cultural purposes, the number of visitors from the United States has skyrocketed. It's important to bear in mind that not back to the very good question on the embargo. The U.S. is already one of the main sources of international tourism for Cuba. The U.S. is already the main source of food imports for Cuba. This is a decision made under George Bush's presidency. It's a big loophole in the embargo. The U.S. exports food and many other agricultural products to Cuba. So there are a number of ways in which the U.S. is already a very significant partner of the Cuban economy. The U.S. is by far the largest source of international financing for the Cuban economy. It's not called that way. It's called remittances. This is what the one part of the Cuban American community in Miami denounces the Castro government. The other part of the Cuban American community in Miami is the main financier of the Cuban economy.
Yeah, wow. What are the implications of the rise in wealth inequality in the island, especially in the Afro-Cuban population?
So that is, in fact, a difficult to study and very important topic. A baseline, I had mentioned that Cuba had become a society very equal in outcomes. And around 1980, a variety of international research projects were able to look at relatively easy to verify records on schooling, on infant mortality and the like. And Cuba is the only country I know heir to slavery. Cuba was a late abolitionist. Cuba abolished slavery 2 decades after the U.S. Civil War came to an end. These are non-trivial issues. Around 1980, there was no difference by race in infant mortality, whites and blacks. There was no difference by race in primary schooling completion. This is really extraordinary. I know that's not true for the United States, what I just said. It's not true for Brazil. This is quite an accomplishment. These inequalities have begun to reappear. Access to the new market opening seems to have a racial bias in ways I do not understand. I can simply describe and call attention to it. The connection to remittances is very serious because Cuban emigration is disproportionately white relative to Cuba's population. It means that if a lot of the remittances take place between relatives, which would be logical, that it is remittances between whites. And if you really don't have a method of financing new economic activities in Cuba, it means that there is a racial bias, not because anybody is intending the racial bias, but because that is the way structurally it operates in the financing of small businesses in Cuba. It is easier for a white Cuban to get remittances from a cousin in Miami to open a plumbing business. And so the set of circumstances is widening and deepening race-linked inequalities in ways that are problematic for anything in the future of Cuba. The only research on expressed racism that I know, systematic research on expressed racism, has been done by Mark Sawyer, and it was a comparative study visiting Cuba, of expressed racism in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the United States, published in obscure academic publications for the most part. And what is striking is that the Cubans were the most likely to make racist comments. And so the last observation to be made is because the Cuban government claimed early in the 1960s that it had solved the race problem, it became counter-revolutionary to say that there was still racism in Cuba. If you don't talk about it, it's not going to go away. And so the Cuban government, to its credit, in social transformation, managed to narrow the gap at birth and in schooling, but it did nothing to address verbally expressed racism. And now that you have structural inequality growing related to race, and verbal expressions of racism persisting, as they always have, it is a different race problem than there was in the past.
One last question I'll ask here is, how long would it take for Cuba to become a relatively middle-class society if the politics, if the politics change to encourage this?
So by one standard, it is a very middle-class society. The levels of schooling are very high. Median entry into the labor force is a secondary school graduate. Median schooling in the labor force is just a little bit below that. This is a highly trained, highly educated population in a variety of ways. The production of university graduates in the professions is very high. So one way to think about middle class is in that term, in schooling and professional activities. Cuba is seen that way, a middle class society. What it doesn't have, that we would expect would go with that expression, is these people are paid miserable salaries.
On a world scale.
On a world scale. Many of these professionals earn the median salary. That means many of these professionals earn, in US dollars, 65 cents per day. One of the challenges for a future Cuba is, would they remain in Cuba? Notice that the example that I used in my remarks had people who were living in Miami and needed a colonoscopy paid for by Medicare or some procedure flying to Havana. Well, that assumes that those physicians would remain in Havana, earning more than 65 cents per day, when they could just as easily move to Miami and provide new services in Spanish to the large Latin American community in the greater Miami area. Will the future of Cuba adjust these two ways of thinking about the middle class, not only professional accomplishments, but also income? And that's not a clear circumstance. It is true that once you have an aging population, the young are less likely, the young are more likely to emigrate than the old, and so it's not that I would expect a migratory stampede at a moment of change. But nevertheless, retaining this highly skilled set of professionals, whether in healthcare or in anything else, is a real challenge for Cuba tomorrow.
Well, it could be, though, that the U.S. immigration policy helps them out that way by closing down once there's more liberality in the Cuban government.
So the U.S. Cuban migration relations are interesting in the following sense. On that topic, the U.S. has a stake in the continuation of authoritarian rule in Cuba. Notwithstanding what George Bush said, notwithstanding what Barack Obama may said, they both agree on this point. In fact, even if they don't say it publicly. I can't imagine any future government of Cuba that would have the will and the capacity to prevent Cubans from traveling internationally, as this one does. There is close coordination. There's an agreement. It is implemented by the Coast Guards of the two countries to prevent unauthorized immigration from Cuba. When the U.S. Coast Guard picks up a Cuban on a boat on the Straits of Florida, that person is taken back to Cuban port. And the relationship between the two Coast Guards is professional, excellent, and an everyday relationship. There is a U.S. Coast Guard commander permanently deployed in Havana to coordinate the enforcement of these migration policies. This relationship speaks well, comfortably, to U.S. preferences for migration policy. And it only works if you have a government that has authoritarian will and capacity in Cuba. And this element of U.S.-Cuban relations today and tomorrow is very difficult to manage.
Well, just one more thing I learned tonight. Thank you very much for an excellent talk.
My pleasure.